Well, this morning we're going to be looking at memorial stones because remembering is a big part of our lives, isn't it? Like this morning we had to get up and remember that we had to actually put our clocks forward to get to church on time, didn't we? So, we go to great lengths to remember treasured moments in life, like birthdays, anniversaries, special occasions. And we take pictures, we take videos to capture those moments so that these wonderful moments will not fade from our memory. Remembrance is actually the key to spiritual growth in our Christian lives. Remembrance is the key to keeping our hearts strong for God and keeping the power of sin from taking control over our hearts. But sometimes when it comes to remembering God's faithfulness in the past, us humans can be pretty forgetful, can't we? An example of this happening was when the Israelites had been delivered in an amazing way from slavery in Egypt and brought through the Red Sea into the wilderness. Straight after they got through the Red Sea on dry land, they were there all praising God with singing, and the women were singing and dancing with their tambourines. The way that they were praising God, we would think that they would never forget that God had saved them from that large Egyptian army, and how that they would have died if the Lord hadn't intervened. And we hear them singing in Exodus chapter 15, verses 1 to 11, I will sing to the Lord because he has won a glorious victory. He has thrown the horses and their riders into the sea. The Lord is my strong defender. He is the one who has saved me. He is my God, and I will praise him, my Father's God, and I will sing about his greatness. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. He threw Egypt's army and its chariots into the sea. The best of its officers were drowned in the Red Sea. The deep sea covered them. They sank to the bottom like a stone. Your right hand, Lord, is awesome in power, and it breaks the enemy in pieces. And they continue this right through the whole chapter. Not that they had chapters in those days, but for a long time, they were praising God and giving him the praise that he deserved, like also what's up on the screen. Who is like you, wonderful in holiness? Who can work miracles and mighty acts like yours? They just had so much praise for the Lord, their great deliverer. But then in a span of just 3 days, the Israelites are grumbling to Moses and Aaron about not having any water to drink, and soon after not having any food to eat. And the children of Israel say to Moses and Aaron in Exodus chapter 16 verse 3, we wish the Lord had killed us in Egypt. There we could at least sit down and eat meat and as much other food as we wanted. But you've brought us out into the desert to starve us all to death. What an amazing change of attitude they had towards God. Where was the praise now to God? Where was the trust in God? And so after looking at that account, we want to say to the Israelites, how can you ever forget the Lord, what the Lord did for you? You should have remembered. The water stood up like two walls, as you walked through the Red Sea on dry ground. The Lord with his mighty hand saved you. How could you ever forget that? Don't you think that the God who can save, that can do something absolutely amazing like parting the Red Sea, is also capable of giving you water and drink? But then, of course, we remember that we do the same sort of thing likewise. Just like they do. God brings us through trials. He answers prayers. And within a few days, it's forgotten. We might not have even given thanks to God. And we can just be like the children of Israel also, finding reason to complain that life is hard to deal with. And so because we're forgetful people, that is the reason why we build and need memorials in our lives, to remember people and events from the past. These memorials can take many forms today, but they still call people to remember that event or where people died in battle. We also place gravestones or headstones where our loved ones who have died are buried, and we do this to remember them. Throughout the world there are many memorials that commemorate important events in history. Many people have spent much time, money and thought into them, and they look amazing, don't they? But God has given us a greater memorial that stands before all generations as a witness to His majesty, His holiness and His goodness, which is His name Yahweh. In Exodus chapter 3, verse 13 to 15, we're told that Moses asked the Lord what His name was, so that he knew what to tell the people when they asked him what it is. And God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And He said, "You shall tell the children of Israel this, I am has sent me to you." And God said moreover to Moses, "You shall tell the children of Israel this, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial, or the way you will remember me to all generations." And even though His name was to be a memorial to all generations, it's not like the memorials set up by men to remember people that have died. Yahweh is to be remembered and praised because, as His name implies, that He is alive, and He shows that He is self-existent. He has His being of Himself, that He is eternal, He's unchangeable, and always the same yesterday, today, and forever. Also, He is faithful and true to all His promises, unchangeable in His word, as well as His nature. All else have their beings from God and are wholly dependent upon Him. And that is what we need to be telling our children. There are also places where memorial stones were erected to remember certain events. Just to name 3 of these was Jacob, who set up a pillar to commemorate the amazing vision of God in Bethel. That's in Genesis 28, verse 10 to 22. Samuel also set one up after the victory against the Philistines in 1 Samuel 7, verse 7 to 12. And he called that Ebenezer, the stone of help, saying, "The Lord has helped us up till now." And the third one, of course, is Joshua's stones of remembrance in Joshua chapter 4. Here in these earlier chapters of Joshua, the crossing of the Jordan represented a major change for the nation of Israel as they entered into the promised land. Gilgal being the first place to arrive, it was a place for a new beginning. Their wilderness wanderings were over. No longer would Israel be fed with manna provided by the hand of God. The Israelites carry out a mass circumcision at Gilgal, renewing their covenant with God. and also the Passover ceremony could be remembered again as they come into the promised land, right at the right time for when that Passover was to take place. I would love to know how the children of Israel were feeling at this time. I would like to think that they were very excited. These ones in the pictures, I would have liked to see them smiling a bit more, because they didn't have to walk through the desert anymore. They were no longer limited in what they could eat. They should have been thrilled that they were in the promised land, for everything that God has promised up to this time had come to pass. To get into the promised land, though, we are told an amazing miracle God performed for his people. He caused the Jordan River to stop flowing so that they could cross on dry ground into the promised land. God then instructed them through Joshua to gather 12 stones from the Jordan to set up as a memorial. One man from each tribe was selected to take a stone from the riverbed. Joshua set them up at Gilgal as a sign or as a remembrance of what God accomplished for his people on that day. And what we see is that those stones are an important part of the story. The end of the story is not the crossing of or the parting of the sea, but the pile of stones they raised up and what their significance was. Joshua chapter 4 verse 6 and 7 says, "These stones will remind the people of what the Lord has done. In the future, when your children ask what these stones mean to you, you will tell them that the water of the Jordan stopped flowing when the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord crossed the river." These stones will always remind the people of Israel of what happened here. You see, to other people, these stones were just a heap of rubble. But to the people of God, they were a constant reminder that Yahweh was a personal and powerful God, working wonders for his people. The story that they were to tell the children was to be told for a particular reason. There was value in telling it. It is just not just a story about national origins or something to entertain the kids. They are to tell the story so that the people might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that every generation might always reverence the Lord your God. Joshua chapter 4, verse 24. If we're not careful, though, this event could just become simply a memorial to something that happened a long time ago that really has little meaning to us, beyond saying, oh yeah, that was neat what God did that long time ago. And so the stones become simply just another cold, lifeless monument to the past. So let's ask ourselves, what was so important about these piles of stones for the Israelites? Why was it so important that the people retell the story and know its meaning? And if we think a little bit ahead for a moment, we will begin to understand the significance of this pile of stones. The Israelites will start to move through the land, but it won't be easy. As they move away from the Jordan River, things will never be the same for them again. Most of them were born in the desert and they lived in the desert. That's what they knew. But now they're moving into an unknown land and future that they cannot imagine. They will face well-fortified walled cities. on foot, armed with primitive weapons. They will face fierce chariot-mounted Philistines with iron weapons. They will be outnumbered by skilled Canaanite warriors, and worst of all, they will encounter the religions of the Canaanites and be lured into the worship of Baal, and many times they will forget God. It is true that God will help them. Jericho's walls will fall down. At Gibeon, the sun will stand still for Joshua. Gideon will overthrow a Midianite army with only 300 men. David will kill Goliath. God will do great things for his people. But in between these great acts of God, the people will struggle with day-to-day living, and they will get discouraged. After the great victory of Jericho will come the defeat at Ai. After the miracle at Gibeon, with his victory over the kings of Canaan, will come the failures recorded in the first chapters of Judges. And after David kills Goliath, he will also have to kill Uriah the Hittite to hide his adultery. You see, these Israelites who now stand on the banks of the Jordan after a great miracle will experience times when they will not be able to see by their present experience that God is working in their lives. There will be times when they will not be sure if God is really among them. There will be times of defeat, discouragement, of despair. There will be times of no miracles. There will be times when their world is thrown into such chaos that they will not be able to see any future at all. It is these times, most of all, that they will need to look back at these stones and know that the hand of the Lord is powerful. In those times, they will need a reference point. They will need to be able to look back and know from Israel's past encounters that God is a powerful God and that he made a way where there seemed to be no way. And for all those that came after them, this will also be an anchor point for them also, for they will draw on what their fathers and mothers have told them. The responsibility of the people was to make sure that future generations knew the story and the meaning of the stones for such occasions. This pile of stones was to be that anchor point, a point of reference for later times when the path would not be so clear. For you see, these stones were not just stones. They're far more than a pile of rocks on the banks of the river. They're a way to recall who God is and therefore what they should do and be as God's people. The stones become a beacon that shine far beyond the banks of the Jordan, far beyond the times of Joshua, and they tell of far more than the parting of the waters. They're a signpost from the past to the future, not just for Israel, but also for the whole world. Another interesting point of the story is in Joshua chapter 4, verse 23, where it says, "The Lord your God did to the Jordan just what he has done to the Red Sea when he dried it up before us until we had crossed over." This reference back to the Exodus from Egypt is important here, because the Exodus also was one of those anchor points in the past for the Israelites, because it was another time when God did great things, bringing them out of Egypt and the amazing way they crossed the Red Sea on dry land. There was no pile of stones to remember the Exodus, at least not physical ones that we know of. But there was a service of worship that the people observed to remind them what the God did for Israel during the Passover. They were told in Exodus chapter 12, verse 14, "And this day shall be unto you for a memorial, and you shall keep it a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. You shall keep it as a feast by an ordinance forever." And then in verse 25, "When you enter the land that the Lord will give you, you will be, you as he promised, observe this ceremony." And then it continues in verse 26 and 27. "And when your children ask you, 'What does this service mean to you?' then tell them, 'It is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and spared our homes when he struck down the Egyptians with a mighty hand. The Lord brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery.'" So why was it so important to commemorate this event by a ritual? Again, if we think ahead in the story, we see it as the same reason as Joshua chapter 4. Because we know the Israelites had escaped from Egypt through God's great deliverance, but ahead of them lay the desert with all its perils. They will grow discouraged. They will fail. They will sometimes wonder where the God of the Exodus is. They will turn to the worship of a golden calf. They will even want to return back to Egypt and slavery. It will be a long journey between the Exodus and the crossing of the Jordan. And in that gap between those two events, the people will experience times when they will not be able to see by their present experience that God is with them. In those times they will need to look back and know that the hand of the Lord is powerful. In those times they will need an anchor point. They will need to be able to look back and know from the past events that God is God. For they will say, "We are not sure right now about God's presence, but we know for certain that God is God, because once we were slaves in Egypt, but God has brought us out of that with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm." So I don't think it was an accident that as Jesus sat with the 12 disciples at the Passover, that he asked the disciples to remember what God was unfolding before their eyes. As Jesus took the bread and passed the cup, he asked them to remember him through this ceremony. Right here, Jesus was building a new pile of stones. So why was it so important that they commemorate Jesus in the way that they did? And again, we have to look ahead in their lives to see that. For the disciples, there will be persecutions. They will grow fearful and discouraged. They will fail. They will wonder whether Jesus really was who he said he was. They will have to live most of their lives in a very real world, in a world where resurrections don't happen every day. They will experience times when they will not be able to see by their present experience that God is working for his purpose. As those disciples lived in a world of prisons, of scourgings, of persecutions, and of Roman crosses, It is in those times that they will need to look back. And they will need to have an anchor point. They had to have a reference point by which they could see that Jesus was true and was who he said he was. For them, they will be able to remember the empty tomb, and because they would have been able to say, we know for certain that Jesus is alive, because once we stood and looked into that empty tomb, and we know that even some of them entered into that tomb. And also they will be able to remember the words of John 11, verse 25. I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. Christ is our Passover. He's also described as our living stone, and believers can look back at him as a reminder of God's powerful work through his Son. Jesus spoke in Matthew, Mark and Luke about the Lord's Supper, and it is without question one of the greatest memorials ever erected, because monuments built by man and just fade and decay over years. But this one will never fade or decay. You know, it's lasted 2,000 years. It has stood the test of time. And wherever faithful people assemble to eat and drink the communion of the body and blood of Christ, in remembrance of him, just like we've done this morning, it brings fresh to their minds the pain, the suffering, and the death of our loving Saviour. And so it is in our lives. If we are fearful, if we are discouraged, if we struggle to see God working in our lives, may we never forget these anchor points, these wonderful memorials that God has given us and to our children.